We're going to go now to Charlotte Haigh, speaking about inclusive, authentic assessment.
Okay, well, we're just getting set up. I'd first of all like to say thank you to Jess for doing a lovely introduction to my presentation. There are lots of similarities. But also I want to keep in mind what Thomas said earlier this morning. He talked about getting students engaged in assessment, so keep that in mind. Also, he talked about using assessment that has involves local knowledge and support, so things that they're accessing in the teaching sessions, so expertise from the class, and also skills for employment. So you can see there the title of my presentation. I tried to win the prize of the most student education buzzwords in one presentation title. But we will go through all of these individually and linked to a module which sounds very similar to a module that you've just heard about. So this is a module at the University of Leeds. It's a level 5 course called Skills in Communicating Research Beyond the University. It's an 11-week course with 2 hours of teaching in person every week, but it's an elective course across the university, so it's not compulsory for any student, but it's open to every student across the university. I do have a limit on numbers, obviously, because I don't want every student in the university to take this module. This has increased over the years. The previous year it was 30 students, we increased it to 60 students this year due to demand. On average, this usually means there are students on around 15 different programmes, not all science, so I have to be quite flexible in what we deliver. So it's based on working with research academics doing research at the University of Leeds across all areas, who come into these sessions and present their research to these students. We usually choose around 5 or 6 researchers per year. These are ones that have contacted our public engagement department and want to have ideas generated by our undergraduates for them to engage with the public with their research. So it's beneficial to the researchers themselves that these undergraduates are going to design projects that they can then implement in their research areas if they wish. So it's student-centred. It's always awkward when you ask students what they want out of a module when you've already planned it. What happens if they come back to you and say it's something that they really wanted to get out of it that you hadn't prepared? But I thought I'd give it a go. It's a discovery module, it's an elective, they choose to do this module. So I wanted to make sure they were getting what they wanted out of it and what they expected to get out of it. So in the first session, I get the students to reflect on, in an active way, by writing it down and discussing in small groups, what they want to gain out of the module. Then I capture this on a discussion board, and then I can keep referring back to people who've said, oh, this was something you were interested in, or this was something you were interested. So they know that I'm trying to tailor the module to what they want. But most obviously, they tend to talk about skills, because it's called Skills in Communicating Research. So they talk about communication, problem solving, creativity, negotiation, decision making. Sometimes they'll pick up on the knowledge aspects, but we tend to cover different audiences, planning activities, demonstrating impact, how to effectively evaluate these engagement events. We talk about working with the media and different media outlets. We talk about ethics, and we talk about funding. It's challenge-led. So once these researchers have been in and told students about their research and really enthused them, which they do, the challenge for as an individual student on this module is to think about a relevant group in society and how they could take this research that's been done in Leeds and showcase it and share it, but of mutual benefit not only to the stakeholder, the audience, but also to the researchers themselves. So they've got to really think quite creatively. And that is their assessment piece. So they have to design a project that they can then give back to the researcher and say, this is a plan for your public engagement activity. So I said this was an 11-week course, 2 hours a week. We do this in active workshops. So it's really encouraging the students to talk to each other. Which was really apparent this last year when they've not talked to each other for an awful long time in person. They really enjoyed that side of it. But what I've put in the little bubble there is, don't presume they're willing to talk to each other. Quite often you'll set them a task and they'll all sit there really quietly and stare at each other. I think a bit like what we did in the icebreaker yesterday to start with. So you have to give them something to talk about, something that's not necessarily academic. I usually use communication bingo. If you want to know what communication bingo is, I can tell you at another time, to start them talking to each other. Because of course, it's a discovery module. They don't necessarily know anybody else on the module. So each of the sessions involves some content delivery, usually some sort of guest speaker, interspersed with different group activities, where they can keep relating back to the piece of research they've chosen that they're going to communicate. So when we're talking about audiences, for instance, they'll go back and think, right, I'm going to do the research on Parkinson's disease. What audience am I going to pick? How do I profile that audience? So every time we've got a session, they can relate it back to the assessment piece. There's very much a peer support and sense of belonging in this module. They don't all attend, as always, but the majority that do really get engaged, really look forward to it, and work with each other. And they're always the ones that do better in the assessment piece at the end. And then every week I ask them to reflect on that session, on whoever was the guest speaker, what they contributed to it, but also how that relates back to their assessment piece, so that they're continually just writing a few sentences about what they got out of that session, which helps them formulate their ideas for the assessment piece. Now, I'm claiming this is inclusive, authentic assessment. It's a step that way. I'm not saying we've absolutely nailed it. But the assessment is this challenge. In previous years, I've got them just to do up to a maximum 20-page report. Okay, I didn't want to stifle their creativity, so I didn't want to limit the number of pages so they couldn't put things in there that they really wanted to. But this year, I increased the numbers, and I also thought, well, when are they going to write a report like that? So I decided to say the audience that they were aiming their assessment piece to was a grant awarding body for public engagement. And then they had a choice of 3 different pieces. It's completely their own choice of which they picked as the output. There was a grant proposal, standard grant proposal, few questions, limited number of word answers, and they could fill it in a pro forma, trying to draw out the information that was required from the grant funding body. So I thought, well, actually, I think most of the students will pick that because that's not too difficult, and they can see they've done some similar things in the past. The second option was an elevator pitch. So very similar to the podcast, but this was video as well. They did a 5-minute recorded elevator pitch of why we should fund their proposal. And then I had a few structured interview questions just to make sure that I got the relevant detail out of them so that the marking could be more consistent across the 3 pieces. And then the final one was an electronic portfolio. At Leeds, we invested in PedalPad a couple of years ago. It's good for some things, it's not great for others, but for doing an e-portfolio, it really allowed that creativity of the students to come through because they can create things. I had one student who created an example of a TikTok that they would have put into one of these into the public engagement activity that they were presenting. So there was a choice of these 3 outputs. Because it's 100% assessment for a 10-credit module, I was concerned that if the students couldn't have some advice on their ideas before they submitted it, they get quite anxious about, have I chosen the right thing? Is this what you want? You know, the usual sort of questions. So we timetabled in, every student had the opportunity to do a 5-minute informal presentation in a small group, so not in front of everybody, and get some feedback from me mid-course on their ideas. Some had a fully formulated idea, some came with a few bullet points, but still it allowed me to give them some examples and hopefully push them in the direction of being a little bit more creative. We've got clear guidance for each of the 3 different outputs. I'd even talked them through how to do an e-portfolio online, showed them some examples. I'd showed them some examples of all 3 of the different assessment pieces. But we used the same set of marking criteria for all 3. So they could see that there was no advantage of doing one over the other. Not one student said to me, which one of these is easiest? Which I was quite surprised. That was what I was waiting for them to ask, but they didn't. And I said to them, select it on what you think is going to demonstrate the skills you want to get out of this module. So how did they do on the module? So then I was concerned because I'd done the report before, they were used to doing that. This year we did this variety of assessment. So you can see the module marks in 2021, when we did the report, the mean module mark was 61%. Obviously, we had slightly lower numbers. This year, 21-22, it increased slightly, 63%. We had a larger number of students submitting with 46. Then if we look at the numbers that submitted each type of output, only 9 of them chose the grant proposal, which I was quite surprised about, because that's the one that we would have been most familiar with. 12 of them chose the elevator pitch, and 25 of them chose the e-portfolio that none of them had any experience with in the past. And you can see the mean marks for each of these assessment pieces are very similar. So I don't think there was any huge difference in that. So what did the students think about having a choice of assessment? They've never had the choice of assessment in any other module that they've studied. So there was only 17 respondents, but I don't think that's bad out of 46 students that did it. And all of them said they preferred having a choice. None of them wanted to be directed to one of them. And I said, how did you feel about these pieces of assessment? And some said they enjoyed it. It allowed them to choose one that they were most confident with, or that they thought reflected the best of their abilities. It encouraged them to be creative. And again, what Jess said, in sciences, often you can't be that creative, and there is probably half of the students on it are science students. And they even left comments like, thanks for the great learning experience. So I think that's fairly successful. Happy to have any questions and comments. Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much. Charlotte, any questions? Yes, Jordan?
Thanks. I was really interested. It's nice to hear about the choice. What about from your perspective in terms of the amount of time it takes to mark 3 different assessments? If I was a student, I would go to the elevator pitch. I would do that quickly, and that's what I choose. But from your point of view, I suspect there was a difference in marking time, particularly the provision of feedback across 3 different. Did you measure that at all, and what was it?
I actually would say it was less than the reports that they did before. The reports they did before was filled with lots of text that just wasn't necessary. Between the 3, I thought they were all perhaps equally similar, but because they're all writing about very different things, it's really engaging. You know, you're not reading the same thing again and again and again. So it didn't feel like a chore. So I actually don't think it increased the workload of it at all.
It wasn't about increased. I think it was just about whether there was a relative. You were saying more or less the same for whichever.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Discussion bingo.
Communication bingo.
Oh yeah.
So I get them to do a grid, like an arts and crosses grid, fill it with 9 numbers that mean something to them, but they've got to be prepared to share them. Then I get them to stand up, wander around, meet someone else with the same number, talk about why they've chosen that number, mark it off, and then whoever gets the full house first gets the prize. But then I had to limit it, because some of them were picking like 2,364 or something. You're not going to find anybody with that number. But then I had to say numbers between 1 and 100, for instance.
Charlotte, that's great. Thank you very much indeed.